Joel Skousen, who's going to bring us up to date with what's really going on, the story behind the story. Hi, Joel. What are we going to be talking about today?
Well, let's first talk about the yet another underwear bomber plot. I don't think it's any coincidence, Stan, that Senator Rand Paul's bill to abolish the TSA is met the following week with yet another phony airline bomb plot. Now, the only reason for choosing a second underwear bomb attack is to make sure Congress doesn't impose a ban on those irritating body-revealing airport scanners, which made insiders like Homeland Security Chief Michael Chertoff a very rich man. This week's CIA-backed plot, however, did more than simply reinforce the need for millimeter wave scanners. It also managed to toss in retaliation using killer drones. Again, just when the public discontent about civilian casualties by drone warfare was reaching a crescendo. You know, I have long contended that the government can and does manufacture terror plots anytime a significant portion of the American people gets fed up with TSA harassment. In order to overwhelm this growing body of critics with the fearful hand-wringing of millions of unthinking Americans in the public domain. The story by the New York Times typified the establishment propaganda that blossomed like a plague overnight on this story. And I'm going to intersperse my comments in the Times to show you how they're manipulating the news. They start out by saying, the suicide bomber dispatched by the Yemen branch of Al-Qaeda. Now, of course, this is another phony terrorist group financed and recruited by Saudi and Pakistani intelligence at the behest of the CIA. They continue, last month to blow up a U.S.-bound airliner was actually an intelligence agent for Saudi Arabia who infiltrated the terrorist group and volunteered for the mission. U.S. and foreign officials said Tuesday. Well, my comment is this is a propaganda leak heard around the world. Newspapers did nothing but simply repeat what government officials told them. There is absolutely zero confirmation anywhere to be had about this story. You know, newspapers are quoting this as fact. It's simply coming from one source, and that's the U.S. government. They continue, in an extraordinary intelligence coup, and my comment, how can a double agent infiltrating one of the CIA's own terrorist groups be an extraordinary coup? Then they say the double agent left Yemen last month traveling by way of the United Arab Emirates and delivered both the innovative bomb designed for this aviation attack and inside information on the group's leaders, locations, methods, and plans to the CIA. Well, all of this story is based solely on what the CIA says, but you know, this is really, you know, how can this be innovative? Here, a CIA agent infiltrating a CIA terrorist group is telling who the leaders are. Well, they certainly know that already, what their methods are, etc. I mean, this is just political theater. The Times continues, a senior U.S. official said the new device was sewn into custom-fit underwear and would have been very difficult to detect even in a careful pat-down. Well, Stan, this is absolute baloney. I've been through dozens of pat-downs since I refused to go through the scanners. Underwear padded with this dense plastic explosives would be easily detected by the kind of search I've experienced. Then they continue, unlike the device used in the successful 2009 attack, or unsuccessful, this bomb could have been detonated in two ways in case one failed, the official said. Well, Stan, this is implying that the original underwear bomber had only one method, a match, and that failed. Well, the trouble is, no trained terrorist would have not known that you can't light plastic explosives with a match. It simply burns the explosives rather than explodes. So they're trying to say, well, it failed because he only had one method of ignition. But, you know, the Times isn't stupid. They've got to know that, you know, this was a phony underwear bomber. But I don't think the original Abdullah Mahmoud had any intention. Of course, he was drugged up. He had to be taken on board the plane. But I don't think the government that put him up to this had any intention of blowing up that plane. They simply wanted an incident that would justify them putting these X-ray scanners in the airports. The Times continues, the officials said the agent whose identity they would not disclose works for Saudi intelligence service. And my comment is the Saudis are the main financiers of terror directed by the CIA. The Saudi government pays the bills for these terror groups so that the CIA has plausible deniability and can stand at arm's length to avoid the charge of complicity. In exchange, the Saudis get protection against revolution from within and from external invasion without. The U.S. also suppresses the huge body of evidence documenting the Saudi royal family's trafficking in sex slaves and pedophilia. Then the Times makes the claims that this source, a CIA or Saudi agent, worked with the full knowledge of the CIA, but not under its direct supervision. Well, that may be a little hard to believe, and it isn't really necessary since there are intermediaries to direct this type of thing. The Times says after spending weeks at the center of Al-Qaeda's most dangerous affiliate, and I say, says who? I mean, how do you rate what's more dangerous than another? I mean, this is just ludicrous on its face. The intelligence agent provided critical information that permitted the CIA, said the Times, to direct the drone strike Sunday that killed Fahd al-Qusso, the group's external operations director and a suspect in the bombing of the USS Cole, a destroyer in Yemen in 2000. Well, once again, the U.S. runs Al-Qaeda at the top. So if, in fact, Fahd al-Qusso was killed in a drone strike, and we don't have any proof of that, no evidence whatsoever other than the U.S. word, then he wasn't one of their Al-Qaeda leaders. He was another enemy, Taliban or other words that they wanted to get rid of, and they simply attached the label Al-Qaeda leader to continue to further this false war on terrorism. A CIA patsy teams up with a CIA terror training center and sends information back to the CIA about themselves, and then finishes off the job by taking out yet another person claimed to be a terror chief with a drone. But as I said, all the prime terror chiefs work for the U.S., so we know the U.S. isn't killing their own, usually. Such news about successful use of drones is meant to obscure the ugly fact that the U.S. kills far more civilians with drones than real enemies.
And I think that's an excellent analysis. Really, it's so tragic. It's so difficult for the average American to believe that our government would create this whole world terrorist movement so we would have an enemy, so the people would reunite behind the government to protect us from the very enemy that our government, or at least the people who control our government, have created. And yet that's the story of communism, that's the story of Nazism, and that's the story of the current war on terror. Well done.
Well, the Times says that U.S. intelligence officials were angry about the disclosure of the al-Qaeda plot first reported Monday by the Associated Press, which had held the story several days at the request of the CIA. Now, this is completely bogus. How can the CIA be angry about a story that only they could have planted in the first place? This is a story with a single source, the CIA. Now, obviously, someone else at the CIA had contacts with the Associated Press and leaked it maybe sooner than someone else. But, this is so incredibly disingenuous to claim that they're angry about some, leak. All these leaks are official leaks. And
I heard somebody just saying, but we should be proud of our intelligence agencies. We haven't had a single airline attack or lost a single airliner to terrorism since the 9/11 attack. They never mentioned that was also done by our own government. We'll be right back. Well, Dr. Stan here at the Genesis Communication Network, coming in from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story, hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at and that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality, not illusion or delusion. That'll determine what the future will bring. Our guest, Joel Skousen. Joel, you pick up the story.
Well, we're talking now about the truth about the Russian troops at Fort Carson. FromTheTrenches.com was hyping to the moon the threat of Russian troops on U.S. soil. They said, quote, John Moore has said Wednesday on Wednesday's broadcast at fromthetrenches.com that he got the news from CIA headquarters, a report that says within the next 7 months there will be between 30,000 and 100,000 Russian troops coming to America to stay. First wave of troops begins on May 21st. Well, there must be half a dozen dedicated disinformation agents working for the government feeding this kind of garbage to willing ears in the conservative movement. Not only are Russian troops not coming to stay, the number participating in terror training at Fort Carson this month is 20, not 20,000, not 30,000, and not 100,000. Now, that said, this is indicative of a continuing pattern of our globalist government, allowing Russian soldiers access to our latest squad-level weapon systems, including high-tech surveillance gear, which they will surely convey operational data back to their superiors. Russia is not our ally. But this is not about foreign troops on American soil, nor a prelude to martial law. There are more than enough American thugs being hired, vetted, sorted, and employed as mercenaries and abusive cops to do the job. So that's my take on the Russian troops in America story.
And, it's amazing how gullible people are. And I got information, on that this morning, and it just didn't ring true. I mean, they don't need to bring Russian troops over here to occupy us. They've always had this whole idea, the Russians going to come and take over our country and the Red Dawn and all of this. It's a great story, but basically we have far more to fear from the people back in New York City at 50, 80, 68th Street in New York City than we do from what's going on in Moscow today, which incidentally we've funded since its inception. In fact, when their dictator, Mikhail Gorbachev, was supposedly deposed, where did he go? Why, he went to the Presidio in San Francisco. I wonder how many of our listeners think that they could rent space at the Presidio in San Francisco. Or maybe they didn't even rent it. Maybe they just gave it to him. And then he puts on meetings, and all of our leaders come to Mikhail Gorbachev's meetings. He was a mass murderer, and he should have been tried for murder and for what happened in the Afghan war and for going along with the use of bombs that blew off the hands and feet of little Afghan children during the Afghan war. But nobody ever mentions that. Go right ahead.
Well, the next story is similar to it. I'm having to debunk three major hyped-up stories. And there's certain websites that do it, and I'm going to discuss some of these things. Doug Hagman of the so-called Northeast Intelligence Network has been claiming insider sources for years within the U.S. intelligence community. In fact, there's a rash of pro-liberty Internet writers claiming similar sources. At a time when government surveillance is almost absolute, this is virtually impossible to pull off in the regular manner of communication that they are claiming. Here's a recent example of what a few whistleblowers have said about the total surveillance state, and they haven't seen but a small portion of what's going on in our country. In a recent segment of the current TV show Viewpoint, host Elliot Spitzer, and I don't trust him as an independent, I think he's a globalist as well, but he did interview three National Security Agency whistleblowers: William Binney, a former technical director, Kurt Weiber, former senior analyst Thomas Drake, a former senior official of the CIA. Now, this is not the anonymous Mr. Drake that is spreading disinformation about the military planning to arrest the entire cabal, which I debunked in a World Affairs brief a couple of weeks ago. This is a legitimate whistleblower within the NSA. Each man talked about what he saw the NSA do when they were employees. Each of these whistleblowers directly explained the threats to civil liberties posed by the lawlessness of the NSA in the past decade. Mr. Drake recounts that shortly after 9/11, he discovered that a legal regime, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, was now being absolutely violated by NSA in league with the White House. FISA created a special court to provide warrants for wiretapping, but NSA was increasingly abusing its authority and was secretly and unconstitutionally eavesdropping on Americans without getting warrants from FISA. And Drake knew that if he remained silent, he would be complicit. I covered this in the World Affairs brief last year, the fact that they take only, I think the numbers range between 150 and 200 warrants per year, just to make it look like they're following the procedures. But in fact, all of the surveillance that they're doing is done without warrants. I mean, they're doing thousands a day, let alone 100 or 200 a year. So the FISA court is just presented as a show place so that it appears to be following the law or the Constitution. The vast capability of the NSA was increasingly being turned inside the U.S., Drake says, to surveil networks, emails, phone calls, etc. Hundreds of millions of calls from individuals in the United States were surveilled as part of a program called Stellar Wind. My comment is, which is a small component of the much larger echelon worldwide eavesdropping system. The United States of America was turned into the equivalent of a foreign nation for the purposes of dragnet electronic surveillance, Drake adds. When Drake pushed back, he was told that the U.S. was living in exigent circumstances by his bosses. But isn't that what the FISA court was for? It allowed for authorities to engage in hot pursuit and then get a warrant 72 hours later. The answer to Drake was that if they went to Congress, they would say no. Plus, the White House had approved the program. Therefore, an official asserted it was all legal. Drake was eventually told, after approaching several individuals with concerns, to stop asking questions and that he had turned into an enemy of the state. That's very typical of what happens when whistleblowers go up against these top officials, and that's why, those people who say, and I'll cover that story next about Hagman, that there are high officials that are, questioning and on our side. Now the CIA is casting a wide net and capturing gargantuan and obscene amounts of data. It is building centers for databases like the Bluffdale, Utah Data Center. It is swimming in data in such a way that only complicates efforts to fight the so-called war on terror. Binney detailed one of the real problems, which is that the FBI can make random queries into the NSA. FBI Director Robert Mueller told the Senate Judiciary Committee that in order to prevent another Fort Hood incident, the FBI put together a database with the Defense Department so it can get all emails and future emails. In essence, the FBI and NSA have been merging. This segment closes with an exchange which I'll probably cover after the break.
All right, fine. And people should go to your internet and just look up Echelon, E-C-H-E-L-O-N. E-C-H-E-L-O-N. The NSA does not monitor all of our telephone calls and emails and faxes. MI6 does, and we do it if we turn it over there. We have Dr. Stan here at the Genesis Communication Network, and our guest is Joel Skousen. And before we go on, Joel, I wanted to tell our listeners how they can get a copy of the World Affairs Brief and subscribe to it, and then tell them about your books, and then we'll get back to this whole incredible scam. What they do is they just tell us a little bit of the story, and then they look highly indignant as if you're really getting the truth, whereas you're only getting a small segment, as Joel says. Everything is in place for the total surveillance society. And it's in the Echelon, and if you can look it up on the internet, they listen to all of your conversations and read all of your emails. They do it with computers, but they have it on permanent file. I just hope they have so much data that they'll never be able to get through it all. But you go right ahead, Joel.
Well, my World Affairs Brief, which I'm giving people a preview of some of tomorrow's coverage, and the World Affairs Brief does come out on Friday, every Friday by email. And people can get a free sample copy of my subscription newsletter by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. On my other website, joelskousen.com, that's S-K-O-U-S-E-N, people can see the pictures and information about my various books that I've written on preparedness, on strategic relocation, North American Guide to Safe Places, a very highly rated book that is selling like hotcakes. It's hard for me to keep up with it. The Secure Homes, my biggest work, everything from A to Z on high security construction, remodeling, residences and retreats, with everything from self-sufficiency to security measures, and major appendix with all the listing of hard-to-find equipment and suppliers. These books can be had from Radio Liberty.
By calling 1-800-544-8927. That's 1-800-544-8927. It's amazing how many of those we put out every week. Go right ahead, Joel.
I'm finishing with a quote from The Point of View with Elliot Spitzer. He starts out by saying, you see what's going on in the Justice Department these days. We're prosecuting Roger Clemens for steroid use, but they make you guys, whistleblowers, enemies of the state. Nobody on Wall Street has ever been held accountable. Do you begin to think that something's amiss somewhere? Binney responds, absolutely, but the real problem I see is that the DOJ is covering up for all the crimes of this administration and the previous administration that they have been committing against everyone in the public. And I would say that is exactly right. So, with that introduction to the all-surveillance state, there is no way, Stan, that government dissidents are ever going to keep talking to Doug Hagman without being caught or stopped. Given the poor track record of what they have been disseminating, I suspect a big government operation designed to make conspiracy theories look laughable. Sure, there's always the core truth being relayed in these disinformation communications about the government being up to no good and making plans to suppress liberty, but almost always these so-called insiders, whether those are talking to Hagman, Benjamin Fulford, David Wilcock, or Lindsey Williams, are either making things up that don't come true or just plain disinformation experts. Repeated claims of an imminent bank holiday, imminent dollar collapse, or that the good guys in the military are going to save us by arresting all the bad guys is just plain not true. Yes, things are bad and getting worse, but they're doing it slowly, even though it may seem fast to you. People in our movement are all too eager to hype imminency without fully understanding that the people running this secret combination of power aren't about to prove us right about conspiracy by doing something big without a suitable crisis to justify it. To do what they are planning will take a very big crisis someday, and that's dangerous for them as well as for us. It's not something that they're going to pull out lightly. A crisis as big as a massive repudiation or collapse of the dollar is frankly just too big to pull off, even for the Fed, given the amount of money out there with no comparable currency big enough to replace the dollar. And forget about the basket of currency. That would require that they enter into an agreement just like the euro to only print a certain amount of money so that everybody could trust. And who's going to trust China to only print a certain amount? Who's going to trust the U.S. to only print a certain amount? Just as Greece, Italy, and Spain cheated, so would all these countries if you try to do a basket of currencies. And what's the purpose then for the Fed when the current system is already giving them and serving all of their globalist purposes financially as well? A bank holiday also serves no purpose for them at all and would jam a wrench in the U.S. economy so quickly that it would inflame public sentiment against the Fed, which they do not want. Now, it's also true that the corruption of law and the Constitution relative to essential civil liberties, like indefinite detention or detention camps, is moving fast. But the implementation of those movements in law are not moving fast and has to wait for a very big crisis like war, which is coming, but not as soon as others claim. A lot of people are talking or hyping that the Iran war will turn into World War III. It will not. I do not think that Russia is going to come to the defense of Iran or Syria. They're not ready to tangle with the U.S. yet. Well, as one subscriber wrote to me, he said, today Alex Jones had on Doug Hagman of the Northeast Intelligence Network. According to Hagman, his sources are telling him that something big is on the horizon. Massive civil unrest and heightened economic turmoil triggered by events like the poor kid who got shot in Florida, among other things. The end result is that this is supposed to come about by this summer in an attempt to suspend the election. During this time, there are going to be many arrests, and the DHS supposedly is gearing up big time for camps and roundups. Well, frankly, I'm going to explain in detail that why this is just bogus. And Hagman is being taken for a ride. So is Lindsey Williams and others that are promoting these types of things. Benjamin Fulford and David Wilcox are another two.
Don't forget Steve Quayle.
Oh, is that right?
Well, Steve Graves is putting this out too. But I mean, I think a lot of these people, it's so easy to get caught up in this, and to suddenly everybody else is saying it, everybody else is feeling uneasy. You want to be on the front lines warning the people. Well, we have to warn the people that Sydney, a lot of this is they're playing games with our mind. They want to scare us to death so we will be totally ineffective. Go right ahead.
Well, Hagman starts out talking about my contact. Just a little bit here about my source and his super secret code name, which he reveals as Rosebud. Well, it's suddenly not so super secret anymore when you can talk about it openly. Hagman says, I've known this government insider since 1979 when it first became a municipal patrol officer. That's a city police officer. He took a job in a bigger city and had a very successful run as a cop. After retirement and after the events of 9/11, he was tapped by the feds, which he worked in various capacities under the umbrella of DHS, and he worked his way up the ladder. Now, there's something wrong with this stand. First of all, nobody goes up the line of even cops without entering as some big city corruption. And you certainly don't get tapped by the Fed after you retire from a cop unless they get the nod from your police supervisors that you're a player. You don't go high up, even within the DHS or any of these federal agents, without being corrupt. Nobody high up in DHS is on our side. No one. But from what I glean from what Hagman admits later on in his article, this guy isn't very high, probably made up his own code name, and has yet another higher source that's feeding him these bogus scenarios. I don't get the feeling when I read the quotes from this guy that he's, a real serious thinker. So he admits that he has another source who's feeding him these information. Hagman says that once he got higher up in the DHS, he finally found himself in what he terms the inner sanctum of the TEC building. TEC explains is an acronym for what he calls the Estrogen Challenge, which houses the upper echelon of the Department of Homeland Security. I'll leave it at that, he says. Well, I can't comment on that. That could be as bogus as the rest of the story.
Well, we're going to be back here in just a moment. Our guest is Joel Skousen, but do not be taken in by all this hype designed to frighten you. Certainly, there's lots to be frightened about. But remember, the other side knows how it neutralizes by scaring us out of our wits. We'll be right back. Hey, Dr. Stan here at the Genesis Communication Network, and certainly our guest, Joel Skousen. Joel, you go right ahead. You were just talking about all the disinformation they're putting out to scare us to death. Go ahead.
Well, here's the substance of the information that Hagman says his source is telling him. According to my source, he says there's talk among the highest levels of the uppermost echelons of the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, which he describes as effectively under the control of Barack Hussein Obama. My comment, the first indication he doesn't know what he's talking about. The DHS is a creation of the dark side of government which gave us 9/11 and the Patriot Act and acts independent of whatever puppet president occupies the White House. Hagman continues, during this call, he said, meaning the source's call to Hagman, he said that the DHS is actively preparing for massive social unrest inside the United States. He then corrects himself, saying that a civil war is the more appropriate term. Well, my comment is social unrest on a wide scale can only come about with massive hardship, and the powers that be are clearly working to engineer an inflationary recovery, not a collapse. He continues, certain elements of the government are not only expecting and preparing for this civil unrest, they are actually facilitating it, saying my source. Well, my comment is, as I've pointed out many times, the government eavesdrops on all communications, and no highly placed government official in an evil agency like DHS could get away with making these anti-government statements, betraying what he's hearing by telephone and not be shut down within days. And yet he keeps calling Hagman and revealing these kinds of things without losing his job. The government tracks all of this and is either setting it up to discredit the movement or laughing out loud at what's being said. The source continues by saying the DHS takes their marching orders from the Obama administration and directly from Obama himself, and mostly from his unappointed czars. What do you mean, unappointed czars? Mostly people have nothing to do with Homeland Security. He doesn't name which ones. They can't all be giving orders directly to the DHS. I mean, this guy is sloppy in his words, in his phraseology, in his concepts. He talks about, oh, and Jarrett, he says, especially Valerie Jarrett. Well, Jarrett is a radical leftist and advisor to Obama, but she's not Obama's main handler. Don't think for a minute that the administration is doing anything to stabilize events like this. He says, these are revolutionaries, and revolutionaries thrive on chaos. Well, this is absolutely bogus reasoning. No matter how radical Obama's background, at some point after going nowhere as a community activist and Marxist, he was enticed into joining the power structure within the U.S. government, who covered up for his foreign status, made him individually wealthy, and put him into office. Sure, Obama's hired a few radicals in the White House to keep himself believable to the radical left who thinks he is their boy, but he's completely controlled by other powers than the revolutionary left. So anyone who keeps talking about Obama is really in there grinding away, engineering one Marxist attack on another, doesn't know what they're talking about. Most of the day he sits there and watches television, waiting for his handlers to tell him what to do. He does not have an individual agenda. This person knows very, very well how powerful the conspiracy is that he owes his life, his anonymity, and his office to, and isn't about to counter them by moving with some Marxist agenda. The globalists, of course, are much too smart to implement Marxism. They have, you know, a much more fascist-style, mercantilist, crony capitalism system that works much better. He continues saying, my source stated he has not seen it this bad since he began working within DHS. It's like they, the agency heads, don't care about the American people see or feel about the DHS and what they're doing. They figure that the average American will put up with being sexually groped and nuked. That's an exaggeration about going through airport security. And this guy's just not careful about anything he says. Just to fly, they'll accept almost anything. That's why their actions are becoming more overt. It's in your face, and the brass actually chuckle about it, said my source. Well, my comment is this is inaccurate. The powers that be are very careful about not getting in your face very often or aggravating the majority of people. TSA is often an exception to this don't rile up the people rule, but that's because they want people to get used to being very controlled in their travel and are never going to relent on this. They do, however, soften their approach from time to time as public protest rises up so that they can manage that irritation. And they do this quite successfully. Look at how compliant other Americans are at the airport and go along like sheep through these scanners.
Well, you know, I'm always amazed to see everybody going in all of these lines back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Sort of reminds me of the cattle being herded on into the slaughter yard, you know, and they all stand there so patiently waiting for their turn to be killed. Well, of course, they're not going to kill us, but the fact that the American people will accept this in the name of being protected against a non-existent terrorist threat always amazes me. Joel, it's always a pleasure. Parting thought before we let you go?
Yes, a lot of news this week about the Fukushima disaster, a lot of hype on that. There is some danger there, but I think it's going to stay fairly stable.
All right. Do you think it's really creating a real problem over in Japan, or do you think that's being certainly blown up as well? That's being blown out of proportion. There is a potential, if there's an earthquake, that those elevated fuel pools could disastrously disintegrate, but that's the only danger if there's another major earthquake there. Well, I think they can make one anytime they want to, but that's just my belief. Anyway, thanks very much, Joel. We'll look forward to talking to you next week. You're welcome. God bless. Okay, well, this is Dr. Stan here, and I hope you enjoyed Joel. He's one of the most astute observers out there, and I think that all of these things are true. They're playing games with our mind. They create our reality. They mold our minds. They manipulate our emotions. Don't let them do it. Learn how to think independently, and that's why I do what I do on a regular basis. Well, Sydney, we hope that many of you out there will seriously consider joining the Radio Liberty family of supporters and help us maintain our network of programs and stations all across America. We certainly would very much like to have you join the Radio Liberty family of supporters. And if you can't afford to, then please pray for Radio Liberty for our provision and our